Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here, and it is my honor and pleasure to get the opportunity to introduce Dr. Dianne Saxe. Dr. Dianne Saxe is an international lawyer, PhD, author, former Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, and president of Saxe Facts. Dr. Saxe is one of Canada's most respected environmental lawyers with 40 plus years of unparalleled experience writing, interpreting, and litigating Ontario's energy and environmental laws. I think I read somewhere that she was voted one of the best 25 international environmental lawyers on earth. From 2015 to 2019, Dr. Saxe was the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. She was appointed unanimously by all MPPs to report to the legislature on Ontario's environmental, energy, and climate performance, and to be the guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights. During her term, she improved the effectiveness of the Environmental Bill of Rights, increased public understanding of the urgency of climate change, and delivered 17 reports on the environment, energy, and climate. Tonight, Dr. Saxe will lead us on a discussion of what municipalities across Ontario and Canada must consider as all of us govern through and beyond a climate crisis. Join me in welcoming Dr. Dianne Saxe.
Okay, can you hear at the back? No, not so well. I'll try to get closer to this mic. I've been leaving my voice behind talking about climate every day. Thank you very much for coming, everybody, and thank you to the counselors for organizing tonight's event. Okay, so I've got far too many slides. The first part is on why we have a climate emergency, and I guess I should ask the crowd, does anybody need persuading in this room that we are in a climate emergency? I mean, honestly, be honest. Would it be helpful for me to go through that in detail for anybody? No? Okay. Well, in that case, I'm going to go really fast through that part and then talk about council. Because, anyway, you guys all know this. Does anybody need, honestly, would anyone like me to explain the mechanism? Like, why does burning fossil fuels? Okay. Is this better? Okay. So I need you folks to tell me honestly, is it helpful to anyone for me to explain the mechanism? How does driving cars, yes, okay. So the gist is this. You think about a bathtub. If the tap drips at about the same rate as the plug leaks, the water level doesn't change, right? But if you put some hairs in the drain and the water can't get out, then what happens to the water level if the drip keeps coming at the same rate? Eventually it overflows. Okay, same kind of thing with the heat from the sun. We get the heat from the sun, comes every day. You can see on the left-hand side, it's always come. And what's almost always happened for the last several billion years is that virtually all that heat has gone right back out to outer space. When we burn fossil fuels, we release greenhouse gases, and they close the windows for the heat to escape. So as you can see on the right-hand side, what happens is that some of the heat that used to go back to outer space doesn't. So it's just like hairs in the drain. Heat can't get away. Gradually it builds up. The world gets hotter. Now, a lot of people think that what Canada does doesn't really matter very much because there's only 37 million of us. But I want you to know we have a really big footprint. Of the nearly 200 countries in the world, Canada's in the top 10 climate polluters, not just per capita, but in total. Oops, sorry. And so the result of burning all those fossil fuels, a lot of which we produce, is we're giving the world a fever. We're blowing away temperature records all around the world. The dark red is temperature records. We're blowing away temperature records by how much we're blowing away temperature records. So you might want to know, well, where is all that heat going? Now, some of it we feel in the outside air. But if you look at this chart on the left-hand side, if you look really closely, you might see a tiny bit of red at the bottom. Do you see a tiny bit of red at the bottom? Yeah? Nod if you can see the tiny bit of red. Yeah? Okay, some people, yes, not people know. There's a tiny bit of red. Bottom line is about 1% of the extra heat that's built up in the world is in the air. This has all happened during my lifetime. About 3% is in soil and vegetation. About 3% is warming the ice. All the rest of it is in the water. Most of that's in the oceans. 3 big things happen when you warm up water. First thing, when you warm up water, it takes up more space. What does that do to sea level? Does it matter if you believe in it? Second thing, when you warm up water, it holds less oxygen. That's bad for anything that breathes in the ocean. And the third thing, and there's a clue on the slide, storms are heat engines. When you heat up the ocean, what happens to the storms? They're more powerful, more ferocious, they grow faster. Now, you hear people saying, the natural reaction for people is when terrible things happen, they get bad news, they want to hang on and wait for normal to come back. And what we mean by normal is roughly the average of the 20th century. That's what our laws are designed for, that's what our infrastructure is designed for, that's what our insurance is designed for, and that's that zero line. And I hope you can see we don't live there anymore. But what's even more important is that we know normal can't come back, and this is how we know. It takes about a generation between the time that we put climate pollution into the air, like driving one of those cars, and the time that we really start to experience the effects. So there's a lag of about a generation. And what's happened in the last generation is that our rate of pollution has gone up and up and up. So 30 years ago, all the countries of the world agreed to an international treaty. It's called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the purpose of the treaty was all the countries of the world agreed we don't want the globe to heat up more than 2 degrees because terrible things can happen, will happen, if we get to 2 degrees. And we had the science for that 30 years ago. And with that science, what have we done to our emissions since then? They've gone up faster and faster. There's been about 270 years of the Industrial Revolution, during which time we have created the problem we now have. Half of that pollution was put in the atmosphere just in the last 30 years. How many people have been in the working world for at least 30 years? Okay, this all happened on our watch. And it happened when we had the science, we knew what the consequences were going to be. How many people here are from evidence-based professions? Okay, a lot of good reasons to have professions based on evidence, but there's one key flaw with it. You can only get evidence from what's happened already. What happened to people the last time carbon dioxide was this high in the atmosphere? There weren't any people. No, this is millions of years before there were people. We are going faster and faster and faster into completely uncharted territory, but the impacts aren't all future. We're starting to see them already. Canada's already warmed twice as fast as the world average. In the last 150 years, roughly, the world has warmed a little over 1 degree. Canada's warmed over 2 degrees. The Northwest has warmed over 3 degrees. We are, just since 1948, Ontario's warmed 1.7 degrees. We're expecting 2.5 to 4 degrees in the next few decades. Toronto, where we've got some of the best temperature records, we know is already more than 3 degrees warmer in the period of time that the world as a whole has averaged 1 degree. We can see the impacts in the weather. We can see, particularly in precipitation in the winter. The dark blue is areas that are getting a heck of a lot more precipitation in the winter, and some of what used to come reliably as snow now comes some of the time as rain, which has terrible impacts on floods and on wildlife and on infrastructure. Now, everything I've talked to you about so far is about averages. Averages don't tell us the whole story. If your head's in the oven and you've got 3rd-degree burns, and your feet are in the freezer and you've got frostbite, on average you are. But in reality, you've got serious problems. So it's important to pay attention to the extremes. Now, how much worse are the climate extremes now than they used to be? Well, we don't have good data for Canada going back to 1850. So I go to the actuaries, the insurance actuaries, and they go back to 1960. Anybody remember 1960? So they use as the base the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, and they say, how much worse are the climate extremes now than they were when I was a young lawyer? And the answer is, on the slide, it's already 4 times worse. So it means when, not if. These are all pictures from around Ontario just in the last couple of years. It means where, not if. We know the weather's going to be wilder and weirder, hotter on average, tougher to predict. We can see the impacts already in insurance losses. So these are insured losses just in Ontario, just from extreme weather. And I haven't been able to get the final bar up properly. But yeah, we had $1.4 billion in insured losses in Ontario last year just from extreme weather. And the Insurance Bureau tells us that the public sector, municipalities, anything you pay for with your taxes, is suffering about $3 billion worth of damage for every billion that the insurance companies are paying out. Does anybody think this might affect the cost of insurance? Hands up, please. Does anybody think this might affect the availability of insurance? And we're already starting to see it. So that's just what's happened already. What's coming? Well, we've already pretty much locked in the weather of the next 20 years from the emissions we've already done. And we're getting a pretty good sense of what's ahead in the lifetime of today's children. The clearest expression of this was in a report by the Special Rapporteur to the United Nations Human Rights Council this year, where he said, we've now reached the point where the best case is widespread death and suffering. And the worst case in the lifetime of today's children is humanity on the brink of extinction. There aren't any bigger stakes. How many people here have a small person you care about? So we're talking about what's going to happen to them. The emergency is coming into focus. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this was set up by all the governments in the world specifically to provide reliable science, consensus, reliable science that public policy can be based on for the entire world. And they had been putting out report after report for 30 years. But in the last year, we've had 3 bombshells from the IPCC, each one more terrifying than the last. So the first one is about what happens as we get warmer. Again, world average. The United Nations Framework Convention, this international treaty from 30 years ago, the countries of the world agreed we needed to keep the heating of the world below 2 degrees because we knew very bad things would happen at 2 degrees. But as the decades have gone on, it's become more obvious 2 degrees isn't safe, especially not if you care about coral reefs and mountain glaciers and low-lying island states and fairly predictable weather. So the first report was, how much worse is 2 degrees than if we were able to stop, for example, at 1.5 degrees? And the answer is a lot worse. Large, robust, widespread, robust differences. Oh, and I see that some of that's covered. But anyway, yeah, 2 degrees is not safe. 2-degree world is going to be much worse than if we could stop at 1.5. The second report came out in August about land and food. Conclusion number 1, the climate crisis is already adversely affecting the nutritional value of food and the security of supply. And number 2, if we continue business as usual, if we don't protect our ability to grow food, then we let the temperature keep rising. We have high risks at 1.5 degrees, very high risks at 2, of a less stable food supply, more expensive food, rapid declines in agricultural productivity, especially in hot countries, irreversible widespread damage to land and ecosystems, more fire, more conflict, and many more people on the move around the world. And the third report came out in September. And this one is about the oceans and what they call the cryosphere, which is everything frozen. And the short answer is that everything frozen is melting faster and faster and faster than anybody thought possible, even when the last major international assessment came out 5 years ago. The coast of Alaska was ice-free this summer. Last winter, 1/3 of the ice in the Bering Sea melted in 8 days in the dark weeks before the sun even came up. Everything is melting. So the seas are rising faster and faster. The oceans are in crisis. We expect soaring flood damage, dire water shortages, and again, probably hundreds of millions of people on the move in the next few decades. If that weren't enough, we also had a bombshell report from the biodiversity people. So there's another whole convention looking just at what's happening to everything that lives other than people. And what they've told us is there's already 1 million species in serious risk of extinction because of the climate crisis. If we continue to burn fossil fuels as we are, we're going to see a dramatic impoverishment of the natural world and a dramatic reduction in the natural systems on which our lives depend. If that weren't enough, we have the World Health Organization also come out saying this is the largest health crisis in the world, and the health damage will be cost twice as much as what it would cost us to get off fossil fuels. For every dollar we don't spend getting off fossil fuels, we're going to spend 2 in health damage. We see some of these things here already. First epidemic of climate change already here. We also have a new report this summer on, well, we know that the weather is mostly locked in for the next 20 years. That's the short term. What are the impacts going to be here in Canada, where we are the luckiest people in the world? They estimated an 85% chance of catastrophic damage to physical infrastructure. And what do they mean by catastrophic? They mean billions of dollars in annual cost, millions of people affected, thousands of square kilometers irreversibly damaged or in decline in the next 20 years. How many people expect to be around for the next 20 years or care about someone who will be? Okay. Oh yeah, in terms of what that picture is, so this was Hurricane Dorian, you remember that in September? It didn't just hit the Bahamas, it also hit Canada, and that's a crane that fell down in the middle of Halifax. And when I was there 6 weeks later, it's still there. People can't get back into their homes. The road is closed. The businesses are closed. And one of the businesses that was closed was a law firm, so anybody whose files were in that office has been completely stuck with no end in sight. And what else is ahead? So we're really at a tipping point. We have a choice to make. We have to cope. There's a lot of unavoidable change we have already locked in from what we've already emitted. So we're going to have big changes to cope with no matter what we do. But if we do not also mitigate, if we do not also dramatically reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, if we do not dramatically and immediately reduce our use of fossil fuels, then we can expect the changes to multiply so much that we will not be able to adapt. The 1.5 degree report showed us that once we get past 1.5 degrees, we can expect the ability of human and natural systems to cope to start to collapse. So, do we want a 2 degree world? Well, we sure don't want it worse than that. If we want to at least stay within 2 degrees, we have to be cutting our emissions more than 5% every year starting right now, starting tomorrow morning. Because we're almost out of time. And that means that we have to entirely get rid of 1/4 of today's emissions in the next 11 years or so, within the working lifetime of probably everybody's car. If we wanted a 1.5 degree world, we've got to be cutting our emissions in half in the next 11 years or so. And we have to be to net zero in 2050. 2050 still sounds like a long way away, but it's not when you have to build stuff. So we have an enormous task. Right, now this isn't going to work because I forgot to change this slide. Well, anyway, you're just going to have to imagine. There's a spiral, the Climate Lab book spiral. It will show you, if you want to look at it, is how much of the 1.5 we've used up in our lifetime. I should have changed the slide. Anyway, bottom line is we've used most of it up. So, is it too late? Well, I have to say, too late for what? Is it too late for that young person that you care about to have the same world that we did? And the answer is yes. We threw that away. We threw that away after we knew the consequences. But it's not too late yet to make a big difference in what's coming. We're in that moment right now. The door is not closed yet. And yes, it's hard when we go to provincial government going as rapidly as possible in the opposite direction on practically everything I care about, but nevertheless, municipalities have got things they can do. So how does Hamilton respond to all of this? The first piece is the corporate footprint of the municipal operation itself. And there's lots of things in that footprint. Some of them are captured by the current inventory. Some of them not yet, but at least it's a start, and this is what it looks like. And as you can see, no surprise, the municipal corporation, this is what the municipal government itself does. Most of the emissions come from, come on folks, there's a clue on the slide. Vehicles, exactly. Which is not surprising. That's generally the story all across Ontario, is most of our emissions come from vehicles. So if you compare industry and individuals driving around, which one produces more emissions? Most of our emissions come from individuals. So you have to start by knowing what your emissions are. The second thing you have to do is have a target. And I think the target has to be based on science, because we are in a collision with physics. And guess what? Physics is going to win. This is not a question anymore of a balance between what we can afford, what's convenient, what is council going to want to approve, because there are real consequences. We have behaved for 50 years as if there were going to be no consequences to throwing our filth into the air. And we were wrong. So we have to have targets. The target should be based on the science. It should be, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, something in between, but if it's more, you know what you're buying. And then when you have your target, you have to have a real carbon budget. The same way you use a financial budget, you have to have a carbon budget. And that means trade-offs, very difficult trade-offs. In the same way that the city budget is agonizing, because you want to do all these things and there's only money for so much, it's the same with the carbon budget. If you're going to stay within a carbon budget, which we have to, or we're not going to get to these targets, choices have to be made. And there's going to be real trade-offs. So here's a batch of examples of things that some cities are doing. Certainly electric buses are a no-brainer, really good for public health, really good for emissions. They're even going to be cheaper to operate over time. Having visible EV charging everywhere. I have to say, walking up to the City Hall of the City of Hamilton, this is my impression. There's a highway in front, right? Many, many cars going very, very fast, no bike lanes, no bus lanes, almost no trees, no solar visible, no bike parking visible, no sign of anything but this being a car city. Is that the city you want to be? Well, that's what it looks like. We know that there's big, big health benefits. In some ways, that's some of the fastest benefits of getting off fossil fuels is the health benefits. And just the number of deaths that are caused by people having to breathe the exhaust is huge. There's lots of things that can be done with buildings. People like to do things about buildings, but of course, and buildings are important, but they're not the most important. The most important is the transportation. But yeah, there's lots of neat things you can do. And many of them have multiple benefits. One of them, the thing at the bottom, how many of you have looked at drawdown.org? Okay, lots of people here. Anybody who hasn't, go look at the Drawdown website. It's a really good set of studies of what are the best things we can do that are the most cost effective and the most environmentally effective. And their number one piece of advice is do not leak any more refrigerants. Why? Because refrigerants are uniquely powerful at doing climate damage. They're also costing you money. So no refrigerator, no air conditioning system, no ice rink, no car air conditioning, nothing that uses refrigerant should leak. And when you're putting in new refrigeration systems, better to use things without the artificial chemicals. There's a number of cities that are doing great things with solar. Cities tend to own a lot of land that can't be used for much else, like landfill sites, for example, or sewage treatment plants. Anybody here want to spend their, summer afternoon sitting at the sewage treatment plant? No? Well, the sewage treatment plants are great places for solar, right? They've got large surfaces, they need exclusion areas, and they don't need what's above them. So we've got a number of cities like Raymond, Alberta. I never heard of Raymond, Alberta, I have to admit. But they just won a big prize because they are now getting most of their city's electricity by putting solar all over their landfill and their water treatment plant, their wastewater treatment plant. Fayetteville, Arkansas, you know, we don't think of them as necessarily the great leaders on renewable energy, but they recognized also they've got a water treatment plant, they've got a wastewater treatment plant, it's got a big energy demand, and the sun shines on it. So why not put panels on the roof? And then there's the Hickory Ridge landfill. Anyway, lots of places doing that. Definitely things you can do in operations. I talk about meat because for the very last thing we did before our office was abolished, the afternoon before our office was abolished, was put out a fact sheet on the carbon footprint of the average individual Ontarian. And half of the carbon footprint for all of us, on average, is from four things. Driving. We drive, you'll be glad to know, the world's worst, most climate-polluting vehicles in the entire world. Congratulations. Number two, home heating. Our homes tend to be really leaky. Number three is flying, and number four is eating beef. And that is half the carbon footprint of the average Ontarian. So one of the easy things to do for any organization is don't serve meat anymore. Save money, reduce your carbon footprint, make everybody healthier. There is, of course, the whole cold, how hot question. And how many people have been in the temperature wars in a building? The gender wars? Yeah, exactly. So this is definitely something that has to be sorted out. I was told that the highest sales of individual heaters occur in July when women are freezing in the office. So that's nothing to do. But the biggest issue is who is accountable. Right? We tend to have a very diffuse set of accountability in cities, well, at least to the public. And if we're going to have real achievements on the climate front, someone's got to be accountable for getting there. It makes a difference. What you do with your money, also very important. I learned today that City Council was given the opportunity to take your money out of fossil fuels and refused to do so. Makes a big difference. Bill and Kevin did a really excellent article in September about how what happens, the money flows are the big fuel that's driving the climate crisis. If anybody who's got money in a pension fund, money in a bank, what is done with money is having an enormous impact on our future, so that's something that can be done. And basically the city needs to put a climate lens on every decision. If this decisions the city is making is going to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not just have them grow a little more slowly, if the decisions the city makes will make the transition to a green economy better, then that's making a positive difference for the children alive today. And if the answer is the other way, then you're doing actual damage to the children alive today. So that's the city's operations, but that's a tiny piece of it. Right? Most of the emissions in this community don't come from the city operations, they come from everybody else. So same three steps. You got to know what your footprint is, got to have a budget, and then figure out what you can do about it. So this is the emission profile for Hamilton. And not surprisingly, the steel companies dominate. But if you look at everything other than the industry itself, well, again, what's the largest? The largest emissions are from transportation, right? Everybody driving around. So three key pathways that the city can take to help reduce the community emissions. Number one is a community energy plan. Where we get our energy, it cannot continue to be 75% from fossil fuels. Not if we want to have a future we can survive. We need to stop sprawl, urban sprawl. Building more low-density suburbs are the oil sands of Ontario. It is the largest driver of our emissions. It is it's the most powerful industry, the most wealthiest industry. It has the most political power because of the donations that it makes. They profit from business as usual, but they're driving us into a future that we will not be able to survive. So every decision matters. And, you know, when you want to make things better, the very first step has to be stop making it worse, right? If you're in a hole and you want to get out, the first thing you have to do is stop digging. So any decision that the city makes to buy or authorize something that's going to use fossil fuels is digging the hole. Expanding the urban boundary, putting more sprawl on agricultural land or woodlands or wetlands, that's digging the hole. So things that how can the city lead? Well, these are three areas any city can lead. First is, what does the city actually control? And there's lots of things that the city actually controls. I mean, we all feel helpless to one degree or another, but city governments have power, and they have power that matters. And, you know, they always say, well, yes, but the provincial government makes this hard, and anyway, yes, of course, everything's hard. But there still are a lot of things that municipal governments control. Municipal governments own and operate most of the infrastructure in this province, have a big role in land use. Build the infrastructure, pass bylaws, set the taxes, and buy a lot of stuff. Have your investments and determine how your sites are used. So this is old news. We need to grow in, not out. Yes, we need to accommodate more people, but we have to do that without paving any more farmland. We've got to do it on the infrastructure in the areas we have, where the jobs are, where other people are. And we also have to make low-carbon mobility safe and fast. So this is one of the great stories that I really like. So the city of Seville in Spain. 10 years ago, they had a crisis. There were so many people being killed on the roads, cycling or walking, that anybody in their right mind, if they could afford it, they got a car. And the economy was doing well, so lots of people could buy cars, so the congestion was unbearable. And what they wanted to do was say, is there a way that we can transform this? So they had a survey done. They asked people of the city, would you like a safe way to be able to bike around Seville? People said yes. And they built it. In the next 18 months, they built 80 kilometers of elevated bike lanes on the same level as the sideway, because you know drivers don't pay any attention to the lines. But they tend not to drive on the sidewalk. And so by having 80 kilometers of elevated bike lanes that actually went right through the center of town, so people could go get where they wanted to go safely, and there was an explosion. They went from basically 0% commuting by bicycle to 10%. And when they actually did the numbers, they realized it was the best transportation investment they ever made. For 32 million euros to build 170, 180 kilometers of bike lanes. They got 70,000 trips a day. For the same amount of money, they could have built 5 or 6 kilometers of roads. And you can see they paid 800 million euros for a subway that serves a fraction of the number of people that are already using the bikes. And it became popular. People, there were lots of complaints about it at the beginning, but once people actually tried it out and got to use it, they loved it. And it's now an institution, and it creates lots of other options. Once you have safe places to bike around, you could have a bicycle local delivery service so that people like me who don't have time to go shopping can get on your phone at 10 o'clock at night or whatever, zip onto a website, order what you want, and the next day a senior citizen on a bicycle shows up and delivers it. And wouldn't that be fun? Or even maybe the senior citizen. So there you go. There's lots of things that cities can do to collaborate with other people. There's great potential partners here, universities, colleges, some forward-thinking businesses. There are other institutions. So there's many opportunities to work together. And anyway, there's a whole batch of examples, including joint purchasing, which can stretch the money. Electric buses are a really interesting example. We know that, I mentioned earlier, electric buses are the real sweet spot in terms of a win-win between climate action and public health. Because we have terrible problems that our busiest roads tend to have the dirtiest air in the community. And that affects not only anybody who's walking or driving on those roads, but also anybody who lives next to them. We tend to have a lot of primary schools right on the dirtiest roads, and the data from Toronto suggested that fully 1/2 of the long-term care homes, which have the most vulnerable, the sickest people in the whole community, are on the dirtiest roads, breathing the dirtiest air. And one of the biggest things we can quickly change about that is electric buses. But people say, well, electric buses are more expensive to buy because the battery is expensive. So here's another way of thinking about this. In California, Pacific Gas and Electric realized that they want a lot of batteries because batteries are really useful in regulating a power system. It's good for voltage regulation. It's good for dealing with fluctuations. It's good for incorporating renewable energy, but batteries are really expensive. So one of the ways they made batteries cheaper for themselves is they bought bus batteries and they leased them to a bus company for 5 years or whatever it is for the working lifetime of that battery in a bus. And meanwhile, they're getting rental payments. The rental payments are good for the bus company because they're less than buying diesel. And at the end of the 5 years, the power company takes the batteries. Why do they want the batteries? Well, the batteries in buses are optimized for the power-to-weight ratio. In other words, you don't want the battery to weigh too much because you're dragging it around in a bus. And that will gradually degrade with time. But when it's degraded too much to be good in a bus, the only problem is it now weighs too much for the power it creates. Do you care how much it weighs if it's sitting on the ground in a garage? Answer, no. So for the power utility to then take all those batteries that are 5 years old, they can then use them for another 5 or 10 years, and they got them mostly paid for out of the rentals from the bus company in the first 5 years. And the bus company didn't have to put any cash up in front for the battery, just the cost of the carcass of the bus, which they would have had to pay anyway, and they save money because rental of the battery is less than the cost of buying diesel. Does anybody see here a possible solution? You can share charging maybe with school buses, and there's another really neat thing you can do with an electric bus. Would you want a diesel bus driving in here? No, because it poisons the air. But an electric bus could load indoors. It could load inside a shopping mall. It could load inside a hospital. It could load inside a school. So you don't have to stand out in the cold and the rain. In Toronto, buildings that have direct access to the subways, you don't have to go outside, can sell at a great premium. You could do that with buses if they were electric, but you can't do with a diesel bus. So there's lots of different things you can do if you try the new way. So the third thing a city can do is set a good example, and I've already pointed out your city hall doesn't. I mean, imagine if you were to walk past this church and you look at it, you know two important things about this church. You know something about its religion, and you know something about its values, just from what you see outside. In Kingston, they have Bike with the Mayor. When I was at the Kingston Town Hall, I asked the people there, would you like to see the, well, I'll ask you, would you like to see the mayor show up at a public meeting on a bicycle? What do you think? Right? It's not hard to do. And if the mayor's riding a bicycle, do you think he might figure out whether there were enough bike lanes? There's the carbon neutral cities. They've got a list of what they call real game changers, things that dramatically turn things around for cities. And these are all things that Hamilton could do, starting with a carbon budget. You could have building standards that don't, for new buildings with zero emissions. You could have low emission zones where you don't allow highly polluting vehicles. You could try and make sure that there's EV charging everywhere. And one thing I want to say when I talk about EVs, it's not just a four-wheel car. There are also electric bicycles. There are electric motorcycles. There are electric cargo vehicles. There are all kinds of things that you can do with electricity that don't have to be big and expensive, but they do all need some place to charge. We should not have organics going into landfill. It's just a waste of resources, causes contamination, causes climate pollution. We should be electrifying heating and cooling. We should empower both the production and the consumption of renewable energy. And we've got to put people and equity at the center, and there's a lot of opportunities to do that. So here's a few things that I was looking at. We know that the climate crisis makes inequality worse. The vulnerable suffer the most and have the least ability to recover. And many of the things that we can do about the climate crisis also make inequality worse. We know we have to put a higher price on fossil fuels, but that means for poor people, a higher price on energy, which is a really big impact for them. So we need to solve or address both of those issues together, and there's lots of things we can do about it. So one of the things is thinking about social housing. Social housing is generally built really cheaply. Like the buildings we've thrown up a long time ago, not maintained, not repaired, bad heating system, that makes them very expensive to operate and makes them miserably uncomfortable to live in. Do we want that? What we had under Cap and Trade was a program to make those buildings more efficient. So I had the privilege of going to 2 high-rise, low-income housing in Sudbury when it was minus God knows what. And they had got $100,000 of cap and trade money. They invested in those two buildings. They were able to cut their heating costs in half, and for the first time since those buildings were built, give every single resident a temperature at a reasonable temperature all winter long. And they spent all of that money in Ontario and small businesses. Does this sound like a good deal? We have also opportunities to think about putting bikes or electric buses specifically in the parts of the city where the air quality is the worst, where people are the most vulnerable, where their health is being affected the most. So we definitely have opportunities. And anyway, there's lots and lots and lots of other ideas. The problem is not that there aren't enough ideas. There are lots of ideas. So one of the questions I got asked today is, well, how would the city choose? Given there's so many ideas, how can we choose? So here's my suggestion. You should have a carbon budget, and you should invite the internal departments to bid. So I said, all right, let's say the city manager is able to come up with $1 million. She can challenge the heads of every one of her department to bid. How many GHG reductions can you produce for this $1 million? And if she's not getting good bids internally, she should go externally. What could you do for $1 million to bring down emissions? Can anybody think of any good ideas? I see some people with ideas. And we know that once people get started on this, they find more and more and more things. And we saw this with cap and trade. We saw this with sulfur regulation, that the more you started to think about it, the more opportunities there are, especially if you can do it across silos. And so the obvious question is, how can you pay for all of this? And the first thing is we do have to face facts, right? If we got into the mess we're in by putting money first. If we continue to put money first, we're not going to get out of it. So this is not just a question of what is the financial business case for this or that. This is a question of what is going to get us in the carbon budget, which is science-based. No one's going to do it for us. There's no magic that's going to come and make it all easy and simple and cheap. We are going to actually have to pay for things. Because if we get this wrong, not much else is going to matter. But it's also true that we have a lot to gain. So this is from the new report from the region of Peel, their new climate reports. They say, you know, what kind of things can get better around here? City of Copenhagen is doing a great job really focusing people's attention on, yes, we have a climate crisis. Yes, we have to dramatically change things around here. But we can use this opportunity to make it better. Nobody's life is made better by commuting for 2 or 3 hours a day in dirty air. Right? Nobody's life is made better by just driving through downtown without stopping or seeing anything. There's a lot of things we can do that would make better lives. And there are a lot of ideas being developed on how to pay for the transition. And yes, somebody does have to pay for them. Some things have to be reallocated in the same way that Seville changed how a batch of parking spots were used, changed them into bike lanes. Some things have to be polluter paid. Developers have to pay things. Some things can be done with collaboration. Some things can be maybe done with fundraising. I know that as I go around Ontario, I hear from a lot of people that they would like to invest in something in their community that will actually make things better. And I don't know whether you really want to start suing anybody, but in any event, there are opportunities, and one of the big things that helps is to measure the benefits. The things that reduce fossil fuel use don't just reduce the carbon pollution, they also make other things better. So measure the benefits, value them, talk about them, look for ways to make them count. Tall wood buildings, one of the big advantages of them is they are much faster to build. How many people hate trying to get around a construction site that is blocking the sidewalk and a road of the road for months and months and months? Anybody hate that? It's not necessary. Tall wood buildings don't have to do that. They go up much faster. They need smaller foundations. They go up much faster, and they're much nicer to be in. Afterwards, electric vehicle buses, as I already talked about, huge improvement for air quality and for public health. And there are other things that cities can do to pay for them, pay for innovations without expecting any help from the province, because honestly, we're not going to get any help from the province. We do, under the federal system, large emitters are going to have to buy what's called offsets. We don't know yet what the rules are going to be for those offsets. The federal government said they were going to propose the rules, but we haven't seen them yet. So there's a real opportunity for either community groups or the city to come up with proposals for what would good offsets look like and see if you can get those into the regulation. There's lots of opportunities for fee-for-service. It's much cheap. If you have paid EV charging, it's still much cheaper than buying gasoline. Fayetteville, Quebec, population 6,000. They bought, if I remember correctly, 2 electric vehicles. I think that was the whole town fleet. They had two electric vehicles. So that was great. What they realized is that they don't use the 2 town cars nights and weekends. So they set up a system to allow anybody resident in the town to rent those cars, basically their own little 2-car car share system for anyone in the community to drive the electric car nights and weekends. And people do because it's cheaper and it's more fun. Anybody driven an electric car? It's more fun, right? And so they've been able to bring down the whole community footprint, not only by reducing the buildings, but also by sharing the cars. Then, of course, there's energy audits that pay for themselves. You can have a green revolving fund. The atmospheric fund already does some of that. Toronto has a program called HELP, where the city has a certain amount of money it makes available to people who want very low cost financing to improve the energy efficiency of their homes. So things you can do with that. There are things you can do just by the city being willing to enter into a long-term contract. So I mentioned Fayetteville, Arkansas. I don't actually know where that is, but somewhere in Arkansas. So they wanted to have solar on their wastewater treatment plant. They had the land, they have the sun, but they didn't have the money. But there's a lot of companies that have money that are looking for ways to invest in the green economy. There's trillions of dollars of investable assets around the world looking for ways to be part of the green economy because they see that the fossil economy is in trouble. So the city agreed to put a 20-year contract to buy the power because they're still going to need the sewage treatment plant in 20 years. And Today's Power put up the cash, built the building, and now that's how it all works. You can trade other kinds of things. In Seville, it was one thing to build the bike lanes, but they also wanted people to try the bike lanes, and a lot of people didn't have bicycles because it wasn't a safe city to bike in. So they set up a bike share system, and they made a deal with an advertising company. The advertising company pays for the first half hour of any ride, so anybody in the city can borrow a bike for free for half an hour. And the advertising company got the right to use some billboards around the city. And then not everything costs money. People are motivated to do a lot of things for status, for honor, even just for being thanked. Right? And I would say that the other way too. Some of the councillors that are sitting here have done wonderful things for you folks, including bringing that climate emergency declaration and organizing tonight. Remember to thank them when they do good things. It makes a difference. So there's lots of opportunities, lots of challenges, but how many people would like to have some hope here? Hands up, please. So this is the only formula I know for hope. You have to look at the facts first, even though they're pretty hard to look at. But if you just stop there, it's despair. You can't stop there. You've got to look at your neighbor, find somebody else to work with, and take action together. And that's the only recipe there is.